It is by now all but an open secret, after decades of establishment obfuscation and deliberate desecration of our culture, that the modern art movement, far from a daring new chapter in human creativity, in truth represented an intricately engineered psyop hatched deep within the bowels of the CIA. The target of this offensive, declassified documents assure us, was the decidedly unsympathetic enemy of the USSR. By funneling immense sums of money into the promotion of figures such as Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko, known for their chaotic splatters and featureless fields of colour respectively, the agency hoped that such work would showcase the creative freedom afforded Western artists, in contrast to the rigid and overtly propagandistic style mandated under socialist realism. It was to prove a decisive victory. The US, long considered a vulgar, corporatized backwater, was now elevated to uncontested cultural hegemon, the world's artistic centre shifting from Paris to New York. So too did the campaign succeed in securing soft power influence over European intellectuals and elites. However, among the American public, abstract expressionism continued to be met with widespread derision and bewilderment, severing the common man from once universally appreciable standards of beauty. This could have been no less intentional. Even prior to attracting the patronage of the CIA, avant-garde aesthetics had been employed by numerous ideologies as a means of furthering their own political ends, from Mussolini's adoption of Italian futurism to the Dadaists' use of absurdity to undermine Western rationalism. And yet, it was during the Spanish Civil War that this tradition would reach its brutal apex, when surrealist art was weaponized as nothing less than an instrument of psychological torture. On July 2, 1902, in the affluent Parisian suburb of Enghien-les-Bains, Alphonse Laurencic was born into well-heeled rootlessness. Alternately said to be of Yugoslav and Austrian descent, his youth was spent shadowing his father Julio, a magazine editor of considerable wealth and prestige around the cultural capitals of Europe, a luxuriously itinerant existence he would maintain into his own adulthood. The particulars of Laurencic's post-adolescent life are often difficult to discern. The few fragmentary records which do survive, invariably obscured by his tendency to embellish, if not outright invent, the details of his travels. Among the all too scant certainties is that he had once enjoyed a moderately successful stint as a boxer, going so far as to face national champions, while in 1921, and without the knowledge of his parents, the self-styled adventurer enlisted in the French Foreign Legion and later the Yugoslav Army, although it remains unlikely that he ever attained the ranks he would subsequently claim. Beyond his military pretensions, Laurencic also endeavoured to cultivate the persona of a scholarly and cosmopolitan sophisticate. Upon leaving the service, he once more embarked across Europe, this time plying his trade as a travelling jazz musician, playing cafes, theatres, and even reportedly conducting small orchestras. For a time, he enrolled as an architectural student at a Graz technical school, although he would almost immediately drop out, setting off for Berlin, then capital of the Weimar Republic, accompanied by his new wife Maria. Educated, handsome, and indisputably charismatic, Laurencic soon found work in dance halls, as well as an interior decorator, at a time when Bauhaus sensibilities were in seemingly limitless demand. Yet, with the rise of Adolf Hitler, Laurencic's luck would take a dramatic turn for the worse. In the eyes of the National Socialist regime, such degenerate art forms were innately Bolshevized, and symptomatic of Jewish corruption, and so, bereft of both an income and a creative outlet, Alphonse was left with little option but to return to Barcelona. Here he resumed his career as a conductor, forming an acclaimed and highly sought-after jazz ensemble, his reputation eventually landing him the role of artistic director at the ultra-exclusive Danzigashima Hall. With the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, Laurencic was once again forced to put his musical ambitions on hold. This time, however, he had a plan. On the morning after the failed nationalist coup, the self-mythologizing polymath presented himself at Republican headquarters in order to offer his services to the revolutionary authorities. Despite declaring himself a committed ideological ally, the truth was that Laurencic, a speaker of 7 languages, recognized his artistic talents would no longer be called for in a gravely embattled Barcelona, preferring instead the comparative security of working as an interpreter for the leftist government. This failed to satiate his appetites. Having grown accustomed to the lifestyle his pre-war successes had accorded, Laurencic attempted to supplement his meager salary by selling fake passports to those wishing to escape the rapidly escalating conflict. Arrest quickly followed. Laurencic, alongside his wife and brother Eugenio, spending the next several months shuttled between various prisons and labour camps, including some of the most dreaded in Santa Ursula and Segovia. But unlike many who fell into the hands of the Republican militias, the chameleonic entertainer would be spared execution. Touting his supposed architectural credentials, he managed to convince the head of the SIM, a Soviet-inspired military intelligence service, that he could be put to better use as a collaborator rather than convict. Laurencic granted freedom on the condition that he oversee the construction of a clandestine prison system known as the Chekas of Barcelona. Operating outside any legal framework, albeit with the knowledge and tacit approval of the revolutionary high command, these interrogation centres were modelled explicitly on blueprints drafted by architects of the Stalinist gulags, many situated inside convents and churches, in a conscious display of iconoclasm and willful inversion of the sacred. Laurencic's contribution was to merge this existing apparatus with the aesthetics of avant-garde art, applying Cubist fragmentation and surrealist distortion directly to the human nervous system, in what he himself dubbed Psychotechnic cells. These were nightmarish in their ingenuity. Among his most punishing designs were rooms whose walls were adorned with angular, polychromatic compositions, starkly reminiscent of the paintings of Bauhaus artist Paul Klee. Stripes, angles, circles and rhomboids, arranged to exhaust, nauseate and destabilize. Their colour schemes, Laurencic later acknowledged, had been informed by the work of Johann Itten. Vivid reds clashing with sickly greens or blinding yellows, a ceaselessly flickering light bulb interacting with the murals in such a way as to produce a relentless visual vibration, much like the effect championed by modernist pioneer Vasily Kandinsky. This disorientation was further compounded by an unending metronome set to erratic tempos, along with a prominently displayed clock that ran too fast, stoking prisoners' ever-present hunger and disrupting the natural rhythms of their bodies. The floors laid with protruding, purposefully uneven bricks so that they might be denied even the distraction of idle wandering. As one detainee, Martin Engels, recounts in his 1940 publication In the Grips of the SIM, the psychological impact of these cells was akin to being injected with a powerful hallucinogenic drug. Unable to move or even sit down, Laurencic's bunks had been erected at a sleep-prohibiting 20-degree angle. Inmates were reduced to staring at the sanity-eroding shapes on the walls. The author noting of his experience, "On the 6th day, something strange happened. The movement of the lines and the way the cubes stood out created such a perfect sense of reality that I would throw myself at the wall with clenched fists, trying to stop the former and touch the latter." Another of Laurencic's innovations was the spherical cell. Coated in black tar and stripped of all points of reference, the curvature of the walls and oppressive heat rendered equilibrium impossible, all concept of space and time dissolving into a vast claustrophobic terror. Perhaps most monstrous of all, however, were his so-called wardrobe cells. Small wooden boxes, measuring just 60 by 40 centimeters, contorted victims into excruciatingly immobile positions. A high-voltage lamp placed inches from the eyes as the air reverberated with a searing mechanical hum. To exacerbate the ordeal, Laurencic instructed that an opening be made in the doorway so that the occupant could see the guards moving freely outside, as well as the slow hands of a clock rigged to move a mere 4 hours a day. Such was the severity of these torments that few survivors could say how long they endured them, reprieve only coming whenever they were summoned for questioning, whereupon, at Laurencic's direction, they would undergo repeated viewings of Salvador Dali's Un Chien Andalou, a piece of silent, surrealist cinema containing an infamously unsettling scene of a woman's eyeball being cut open. That is not to say the horrors administered inside the Chekas were solely psychological in nature. In addition to the mind-melting qualities of abstract art, prisoners were also subjected to a litany of more time-honoured cruelties, including, but in no way limited to, electrocutions and acid-laced enemas, blow-torched flesh, simulated drowning, and the mutilation of genitals via branding irons. Nevertheless, in conjunction with Laurencic's creative insights, even the resultant injuries, grisly though they were, often paled in comparison to the scars already inflicted upon the captive's psyche and soul. On the most mechanistic level, this relied on basic sensory overload. His cells, after all, had been crafted in accordance with neurocognitive principles, with garish, kaleidoscopic patterns compelling both the eye and the brain into grueling attentional labour. Clashing colours, selected for maximum intensity, produced an incessant visual provocation that, under the stress of confinement, promptly triggered headaches and debilitating fatigue. The uneven floors and dimension-distorting artwork combining to generate a constant low-level vertigo. Even the fluctuating metronome did more than just forbid sleep or invade the sanctity of thought. It constituted another element in Laurencic's rhythm without cadence approach, inducing a state of perpetual anticipation bereft of the attendant resolution. But of course art, even of the most heinous variety, penetrates deeper still. In the vein of the Bauhaus and Surrealist visionaries who had inspired him, Laurencic advised that the work in his cells be void of any narrative to grasp, much less any beauty to appreciate, articulating only a deliberate, illegible chaos. The besieged mind, reflexively seeking to find structure in the cacophony, was met only by the arbitrary, coercive will of the designer. In the absence of discernible order, meaning was whatever this unseen torturer decreed, an all-pervading affirmation that reality itself had become subject to the whims of a malevolent and incomprehensible authority. Few of those condemned to the Chekas, mostly Catholic religious figures and those deemed to have nationalist sympathies, would have ever before experienced such abominations. Classical art, such as that which had adorned the convents and churches they were now incarcerated in, had once offered a coherent, morally resonant vision of the universe, one which pointed towards transcendence and spoke the language of implicit truth. The cells they now found themselves in said nothing. If ever they spoke, it was in garbled, belching gibberish, the very unintelligibility of which bombarded the prisoner with a single corrosive message. You are not a sacred being in a divine creation. You are a single note in an abyss of senseless, discordant noise. When Barcelona fell to Franco's forces in January 1939, the Red Terror collapsed virtually overnight. The prisons emptied, their guards fled, and the city that had once served as the backdrop to a ferocious wave of anti-clerical fervour and anarchist-led atrocities passed into nationalist hands. In the ensuing purges, Alphonse Laurencic, stripped of the protection once provided by the SIM and, more generally, the chaos of war, was at last unmasked as the mind behind some of the most grotesquely inventive, barbarously novel torture methods ever devised. His trial was swift. The judge dismissed his contention that he acted under duress or had secretly aided the reactionaries, emphasizing the apparent zeal and even professional pride with which he had applied his artistic eye to the intricacies of human torment. After hearing his sentence, Laurencic is said to have told the court, "Although I am going to die, viva generalissimo Franco." In the early hours of July 9th, 1939, without ever having expressed any remorse for his crimes, Laurencic was taken to the Campo de la Bota, a barren coastal stretch that had already witnessed hundreds of political executions and which, in the coming years, would witness many hundreds more. He refused to be blindfolded. His last act before the firing squad was ordered to pull their triggers, perhaps a final, forlorn bid for clemency, was to raise his arm in the nationalist salute. Needless to say, the memory of Alphonse Laurencic is much more than the story of one man's flair for inhumanity. Neither should it serve as some trite reminder as to how art, when placed in sufficiently diabolical hands, can become a vehicle for the most obscene sadism imaginable. Rather, the perverse genius of his cells and the strange agonies suffered within them must instead compel the question, given the society which now surrounds us, is in what ways and to what extent have we ourselves been subjected to a diluted rerun of his experiment? Of course, it is quite redundant to reiterate, as so many have done before, the now cliched criticisms of modern art or the vacuity of modern music, the sterile propaganda which disfigures modern public spaces, the flat-packed functionality which fills modern homes, or the glass and steel monotony that dominates the modern skyline. Mercifully, these ambient indignities will likely never reach the depths endured by those entombed within the Chekas of Barcelona. Yet, deprived of both order and the ennobling potential of beauty, it would seem that the aesthetics of our lives have come to ever more resemble, much as Alphonse Laurencic envisaged, the labyrinthine emptiness of our own psychotechnic cell. Hi everyone, and thanks an awful lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you could give it a like or a share. I can't tell you how much that helps. Well, if you're interested in seeing others like it, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Alternatively, you can always find more of my written work over on Substack, the link for which is in the description. Thanks again for your time.